Hello everybody, and welcome to our listeners of Radio Concrete. During the next hour, we will listen to a radio artwork which I composed specifically for the radio marathon organized by Het Concreet in Tilburg. We will listen to a mix of different field recordings which are recorded during my last trip to Italy, mainly in Florence and in the Italian Western Alps, mixed together with electronic sounds, resulting in a soundscape composition specifically tailored for radio broadcasting. My name is Margherita Brillada. I'm a sound artist, radio maker, curator, and electroacoustic music composer. I'm currently a research associate at the Institute of Sonology in Den Haag and a PhD candidate at the ACPA, the Academy of Creative Performing Arts at the University of Leiden, with a practice-oriented research project entitled Rethinking Radio Art in the Contemporary Era, Community Radio and Web Radio. By rethinking radio as an exhibition space for experimental sound art, the project attempts to articulate what I defined as specific radio poetic according to the sonic dimension intrinsic to the medium. In my artistic practice, I pay particular attention to the urban soundscape and the anthropogenic presence in public spaces, emphasizing the role of the disembodied and acousmatic voice in the radiophonic context. To collect the sound materials in my practice, I include sound works as an exploration in situ of site-specific space, with different field recording techniques, to broadcast them on radio. My artistic practice centers on the use of field recording as a source of reflection, with a sensitive focus on capturing the interplay between the anthropogenic and biodiversity elements within the urban soundscape. My creative choices are shaped by a personal interpretation of the sonic environment as a reflection on the social, technological, and natural conditions specific to the area, and then broadcasted on the radio. My choices are influenced by an understanding of the sonic environment as an intimate reflection of the social, technological, and natural conditions of the area. Radio art, an elusive definition. As an experimental acoustic form at the intersection of sound art, sound poetry, and drama, radio art has only occasionally been the subject of artistic research studies. The term radio art refers to the artistic form composed of acoustic material of various origins, broadcasted via radio and designed to fit the overall radio program schedule, while avoiding standardized formats of mainstream radio. My PhD project explores the potentialities of radio as an alternative medium, rather than a mass medium, within the contemporary media landscape. It seeks opportunities to create and sustain new acoustic narrative strategies and challenge the typical conventions associated with the radio medium as a transmission channel. During this performative lecture, I want to enunciate the three categories of question of investigation which I delineated during my first year of PhD research, which are at the core of the project. This categorization will outline the overall perspective of my understanding, interpretation, and contribution to radio art. These three macro categories of question of investigation, that in turn unfold micro categories, are subdivided as follows. The first macro category is related to the compositional approach, in which I see radio as a compositional tool. In my practice, I explore and experiment with radio paradigms to generate, manipulate, structure, and present electroacoustic composition. Exploring the interaction between different types of media, the impact of the radio on the listening experience, one of the aims is to produce non-linear, immersive experiences using the radio as a platform and a tool to create an intimate space of sonic experience. The second category of question of investigation is related to the technological development approach and related philosophical questions. Considering the quote by Alberto Savinio, where it states that radio is a tool, a medium, and every new tool, every new medium is the origin of a new art form. Alberto Savinio wrote this quote in 1949. So that web radio is relatively a new medium which unfolds a new art form to be explored. One of the primary artistic purposes of my research is to explore the potential of new media in continuous expansion. Exploring how is the intersection of new media technologies redefining radio art, and how this has extended the boundaries of sound art form. The project examines the possibilities of radio as a non-conventional medium, distinct from traditional mass media within today's media landscape. Specifically, investigate the concept of web radio and delves into the various approaches to this form of webcasting. The third category of question of investigation is related to the social implementation, in which I see radio as a social and public space for artistic activities. Toward the definition of radio poetics. After introducing the three areas of study that form the foundation of my understanding of radio art, in this performative lecture I will highlight my newly developed concept of radio poetics, the key attributes of my radio artworks, and the theories that have guided me towards this initial definition. The radio has its unique listening characteristic and some parameters to consider while composing music conceived for it. Keeping in mind that the radio enters into the intimacy of the home and that the listeners are often listening to other sounds when tuned in, like for example the domestic everyday life sounds. The absence of a single and precise singular location, but rather many indeterminate locations. The intermediate space and time between the broadcaster and the listeners allows space-time dislocation, revealing a broken concept of the linearity of time. Radio, it is a medium with a strictly delineated time sequence, in whose broadcasting it is impossible to move back and forth. In this lecture, I want to demonstrate that all these paradigms have to be considered while composing music conceived for a radiophonic context, both from the side of the broadcaster and the side of the listener. Radio is a medium that can be defined as warm because it managed to create a direct relationship with the listeners, and it engaged an intimate way of listening. The concept of directness, liveness, and interactiveness are paradigms of the radio, which are fundamental in creating empathy and connection with the audience. But how to stimulate this connection? With which sonic elements? So, which are the sonic elements at the basis of a radio poetic? In this lecture, I want to talk about how to articulate the fundamental sonic elements that constitute the foundation of a compositional approach methodology for radio broadcasting, ultimately aiming to construct a distinct form of radio poetic. I want to talk about out within my artistic investigation and the specific attributes that I have identified as crucial in shaping the genre's distinctiveness. There are three sonic elements that are at the foundation of my compositional approach methodology and that are the focus in my compositional approach, which I'm investigating to create a specific radio poetics. The first sonic element is related to the disembodied and acousmatic voice in the radiophonic context. The disembodied voice is deeply affected by the paradox of the acousmatic voice, the voice that speaks from an undeterminate source. However, in some ways, the loss of body in radio seems to be particularly the loss of the sight of the body. But it is impossible to completely elude the typical vocal characteristic given by the resonance of the body that emits it.
Sì, anche. Sì, certo. Allora, in Cina non a questo va bene, grazie.
A reflection on the disembodied and acousmatic voice in the radiophonic context is fundamental in my compositional evolution trajectory. Investigating which are the characteristics of the acousmatic and disembodied voice, wondering if the voice can be completely disembodied and detached from a resonant body. As a radiophonic electroacoustic composer, much of my radio artworks have a narrative focus and incorporate the human voice as a medium that allows me to engage with the audience directly and intimately, exploring the voice as a vehicle of emotion and speculating about the voice itself as a medium or as involved in crucial process of mediation. Moreover, I argue that the voice remains an entangled element from a radio artwork. As stated by Naylor, we will use the term radiophonic composition to refer to a sonic artwork whose main linkage with radio is that it is largely constructed around narrative voice. My compositional approach towards the radio medium began with the production of radiodrama, radio documentaries, where the vocal element had a clear, explicit reference and narrative function. Lately, the work has focused on composition for radio broadcast in search of new synergies between pure abstraction and storytelling. Musing on how to use the voice in composition for radio broadcast, how explicit the message text should be, and what the cathartic and centralizing dramatic value of the human voice can be in the musical context, I want to illustrate how and why the human acousmatic voice is the first element that should be included in a coherent radio poetics. Compared with other sense modalities, the voice is a dynamic and accurate conveyor of emotion via speech content and linguistic paralinguistic cues. The intonation and pitch of the voice can provoke different emotional reactions, regardless of the language and the meaning of the word itself. Exploring the concept of polyglossia and the use of paralinguistic cues manipulated in the context of acousmatic electroacoustic music, I argue that the use of the voice in the radio compositional approach should provoke in the listener an emotional reaction response more than a rational one. In his book Experimental Sound and Radio, Alan Bass wrote, "Despite the radiophonic voice is disembodied, the body is never totally absent from radio, while it is often radically disfigured, transformed, mutated. As transformed by the re-recording, looping, and feedback capabilities of sound engineering, the human voice in radiophonic art will project the voice of nobody. We must therefore rethink the radio in terms of a potentially disarticulatory and no longer articulatory side of the symbolic, not representing the body, but rather transforming or annihilating it." So, it is in Pour en finir avec le jugement de Dieu that Antonin Artaud introduces the expression that then becomes popularized by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari of the body without organs and the disembodied voice. But isn't the acousmatic voice somehow disembodied in itself? One of my aims is to demonstrate that the acousmatic voice in the radiophonic context can be disembodied in some cases, even more when it passes through an electroacoustic chain, and when it's processed through a massive sound processing techniques. If the voice can become completely unrecognizable and unintelligible, then we can probably talk about a disembodied voice. Close your eyes for a moment and take the time to listen. Today is November the 10th, 2023, and I'm taking a walk in the Italian Alps, nearby my own town. It's a sunny day. It's quite cold, and there are a lot of leaves on the ground. The second element, fundamental in creating a radio poetic, is the concept of soundscape on radio, the use of field recording and the reflection on the acoustic ecology. Exploring radio art's relationship to soundscape, it is clear that soundscape compositions have moved away from a static soundscape merely played on the radio to an expanded, from which embraces and explores the particularities of the medium. It's windy. You can hear the wind. The Canadian composer, sound artist and radio maker Hildegard Westerkamp. Her sound-walking radio program had allowed her to experiment with recording diverse sound environments and how she communicated with her listeners, engaging them and contextualizing the environmental recordings via quietly spoken, soft, contemplative, intimate and meditative commentary. It was relatively unusual to hear environmental sounds or soundscape on the radio at that time. And she stated, "This type of radio making presents the familiar as thought artificial, through a loudspeaker, second-hand, framed in space and time, and therefore highlighted. Daily life is thus presented from a new acoustic angle. Such radio can assist us in listening to our everyday lives, to who we are as individuals and as a society." We are nearby to a street where usually there are not so many cars passing by, but you can hear them. It's a small, a very tiny little house. Now I decided to go back home. I will take a bag or a nest. I'm now going back home to get a bag to fill with chestnuts. Around the forest, it's full of them. Look, there is my dog staring at me. I would like now to read some quotes by Hildegard Westerkamp in her essay The Soundscape on Radio. You can find this essay in the famous and precious book Radio Rethink, Art, Sound and Transmission, written by Diana Augaitis and Dan Lender. In the mid-70s, two events coincided that have changed the way I think about sound. The World Soundscape Project and the founding of Vancouver Cooperative Radio. The first opened my ears to the sound behind the classical music I had studied for many years, and enhanced my understanding of the soundscape. The other provided the opportunity to organize and broadcast this sound and those to speak back to the community with the sounds of its own making. Both made me think about sound design, composition, acoustic ecology, and how we hear and listen. The World Soundscape Project, founded by Murray Schaeffer in the late 60s, was one of the first attempts to study the acoustic environment and the impact of technology on it. Throughout systematic and critical study, the project coordinated and researched the scientific, aesthetic, philosophical, architectural, and sociological aspect of soundscape ecology. At first, members of the newly formed cooperative radio were challenged by the vast silence of the airways that accompanied the license to broadcast. We knew how fragile silence was and that it could be enhanced or destroyed by sound. In some way, making radio is like composing music. The same care for form and content has to be taken in creating radio as in creating a piece of music. The same questions arise. When to have sound and when to have silence? What sense of time to create? What sounds to select? What to say and how to say it? How to retain the dimension of silence under a stream of sound? How to attract and keep a listenership? The co-op radio airwaves may have been silent at first, but the social environment and soundscape into which we were to broadcast our radio programming was already crowded with sounds. The challenge was to make ourselves heard. Most of Vancouver Cooperative Radio's founding members desired closer interaction between radio makers and listeners. We wanted to do something that no other station was doing at the time, to involve the community in the making of radio, so that radio sound would embody the voice of the community. Any listener could also be a radio maker who might then become an increasingly active listener because of his or her immediate involvement with the station. My own involvement with co-op radio gave me the opportunity to consider radio as an artistically expressive medium and to address issues of environment and acoustic ecology. I was attempting to make radio a place of environmental listening by broadcasting the soundscape that listeners experienced in their daily every life. With that, I had hoped to create a state of resonance within the listeners, so that when they encountered sounds in the actual environment, recollections of the radio broadcast would alert them to the soundscape in which they lived, creating participant listeners, that is, listeners of the broadcast who could then also be receptive to the soundscape as a whole. Most of us have been conditioned, especially if we have lived in the city for a while, to ignore the soundscape, including radio. The result is that we often do not even know what our ears put up with every day, how our whole being might be affected by the overload of sound input, and that we might unconsciously assist in the proliferation of increasingly noisy soundscapes. A question then is raised. How do we, as audio artists, composers, create the desire to listen in a world where the tendency is predominantly not to listen to radio or the soundscape? Imagine radio that, instead of numbing us to sounds, strengthen our imagination and creativity. Instead of manipulating us into faster work and more purchasing, it inspires us to invent. Instead of overloading us with irrelevant information and fatiguing us, it refreshes our acoustic sensitivity. Instead of moving us to ignore thoughts and surroundings, it stimulates listening. Instead of broadcasting the same thing over and over again, it does not repeat. Instead of silencing us, it encourages us to sing or to speak, to make radio ourselves. Instead of merely broadcasting at us, we listen through it. Ideally, when we listen to radio, we are listening to a listening medium. Radio listens through its microphone to the world, to human voices, to the environment. However, the microphone does not make choices, in itself is without culture. The way it listens to the world, it is entirely determined by the recorders behind the microphone. A radio that listens, then, is about the recorder's position and perspective, the physical, physiological, political, and cultural stance shaping the choice when recording. I attempt to maintain an acoustic balance in the environment and to consider how its quality may be improved. To some extent, my recording choices are shaped by a desire to educate, to raise awareness of the present state of the soundscape. By encouraging listening and questioning, I hope also to make people aware of their roles as sound makers and their responsibility toward the soundscape. My own first attempt to create a radio that listens was called Sound Walking, a weekly 1-hour radio program that took a very specific approach to the medium as a conveyor of environmental sounds. In addition, there is a searching microphone. I did not really discover this more active approach until I started recording in quieter, more natural environments. In the city, many sounds present themselves to the microphone. The recordings can remain quite passive and end up with a lot of sounds on tape. Not so in quiet environments. There, the recordist often needs to take a more active role with the microphone in order to record any sounds at all. It is a wonderful opportunity to search for the microscopic sounds in such sonic environments. But recording them at close range, an entirely new world of acoustic complexity can be discovered, all with a relatively silent backdrop. Working with such a recording engages respect for the source of the sound. If we can hear the small sound, quiet sound of nature amplified on radio or in any electroacoustic context, we may understand that even these less perceptible sounds have an important place in the environment as a whole and warrant respect and protection. The small, quiet sounds in the natural environment are symbolic of nature's fragility. of those parts that are easily overlooked, whose significance in the ecological cycle is not fully understood. the third and last category, which is fundamental in creating a radio poetic, is related to the abstract sonic narrativity in the radiophonic context. My compositional approach to radio art began with electroacoustic compositions that can be defined as radio drama with a linear and narrative formal structure to ultimately move towards open forms that experiment and reflect the paradigms and specificities and the limits of the radio medium. The radiodrama was the first artistic radiophonic form. It was born as a broadcast of theatrical works and then evolved during the past century towards increasing experimental techniques and approaches to the medium. I can argue that my compositional approach development in the context of radio art is somehow mirroring this historical theoretical evolution. As previously mentioned, radio broadcasting occurs in time. Radio reveals a broken concept of linearity of time and negligence of the concept of beginning and end, as, especially in FM radio broadcasting, it is impossible to predict when the listeners tune in or out. Thus, we can consider it as a non-linear interactive media. Therefore, I argue that the radio art should avoid dealing with fine temporal objects with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but rather allow listeners to perceive a different piece and create the final version from a framework of possibilities. The compositional approach for radio art should be an open acoustic final result, welcoming the idea of losing control of a temporal structure. We know that FM radio, web radio, and streaming platform all have their audience and different way of listening. For example, we know that in FM radio it is impossible to go back and forth. Why, for example, in a podcast listening situation, we have an on-demand way of listening. The web radio has introduced a novel paradigm for archiving show and conceptualizing radio artwork. With archiving composition on web radio, a more conscious and on-demand way of listening is becoming possible. The era of online radio, its archived shows, and on-demand playback have shattered what used to be one of radio's most defining traits, the unrepeatable, unrecoverable moment of a listener encounter with a sound, a thought, a note. So in this lecture, we have examined various fields of investigation that have contributed to the development of an autonomous theory regarding the interpretation of the radiophonic art. The lecture has highlighted the importance of understanding the sound elements and the formal structure necessary to establish a radiopoetics. Additionally, the characteristics of the disembodied and acousmatic voice in the radiophonic context were explored, particularly regarding their ability to evoke emotional responses and convey meaning through paralinguistic cue. In conclusion, this lecture aimed to contribute to the ongoing discourse surrounding radiophonic art and encourage further exploration of new artistic avenues within this discipline. Thanks to Radio Concrete and enjoy the rest of the Radio Marathon.